Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about Gina Riley. So Gina is based in New York, and she's a clinical professor and program leader of the Adolescent Special Educational Program at, how do you say that, Gina? Do people say
CUNY.
CUNY, or do they
Yes,
have a?
so it's CUNY Hunter College.
Okay, and she's worked a lot with teenagers diagnosed with learning disabilities and emotional and behavioral disorders. She's also done some research with Peter Gray, and she's got an incredibly impressive CV, which you should be able to go and see on the speaker profile. And we're actually very honored to have you here with us, Gina, and to hear what you've got to say. I think it's going to build on really well on what we've been hearing already um, uh, so far over the weekend. So I'm going to spotlight you, and I'm going to hand over to you, and we are here if you need us, so just give us a shout.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, everyone at Learn Free. You've been wonderful. So my name is Dr. Gina Riley. I am a professor at CUNY Hunter College. I run the Adolescent Special Education program there. As Juliet says, I've also done a ton of research for over 25 years now on homeschooling, unschooling, and intrinsic motivation in education. Peter Gray is a close collaborator, as are many others. So I'm so excited to be here and talk about the relationship between unschooling and intrinsic motivation. I am a really good multitasker, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. I love an interactive session. So please feel free to put thoughts, questions, and concerns in chat as I am talking. So thank you, everybody. So I want to tell you a little story about myself. I always think it's interesting when speakers tell you about themselves before I start with the research. So I've written two books. One is a homeschooling starter guide, and the other one is the first academic book on unschooling, and it's called Unschooling: Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom. It was published by Springer Nature in 2020, right in the heart of the pandemic. And it got really amazing press because it was the first academic book on unschooling, and I'm always so grateful for that. A little about me personally is that I unschooled. I was a single mother, made the choice to unschool my son 26 years ago. And his first day of school was his first day of college, which to me, when I say it, is still amazing. I don't even remember all those days. I worked, I went to school, I unschooled my son, and it was really just the best experience I will ever probably have in my life. He is now 26 years old. He works in the publishing industry. He is an associate editor for Springer Nature. He is also a classical guitarist and musician. He is so fun to have an adult child. He is my whole heart. He is the most amazing human, and I give a lot of credit to unschooling for that. I will also say on the other end, I spend most of my life as a professor. And interestingly, I teach teachers. I teach New York City school teachers, public school educators. I hardly ever mention homeschooling and unschooling when I teach. However, I do enter the conversation when we talk about intrinsic motivation. I've always thought, still do think that there are tenets of unschooling and homeschooling and intrinsic motivation that you could bring into the classroom. You can make public schooling even better. So I carry both sides of the coin here, right? Here's this unschooling researcher who teaches public school teachers throughout the day. So it's a pretty cool and interesting job. It also sometimes gives me a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but I really, really love what I do. And I really, really love being at Hunter. So we've come a long way in terms of homeschooling. And you have to understand, I homeschooled and unschooled during the 90s and early 2000s when we were the only person in our district that was homeschooling or unschooling. No one ever really heard of unschooling. We just called it homeschooling. So here we are, 2022. Interest in home learning has doubled during the pandemic. You have stats saying 10% and 11% of American families are choosing to homeschool this year, up from 5% 1 year ago. And that doesn't count the number of families who were like home or remote schooling using their district or home learning using a pandemic pod. That 10 or 11% is the number of registered homeschoolers in the United States. And that's really, really huge. Interest is increasing day by day. My colleagues at the National Homeschool Association in the United States went from receiving like 5 or 10 calls a day about homeschooling to over 3,000 calls a day about homeschooling. So, I mean, you might see these numbers and be like, and I see these numbers being here for 26 years as a home educator. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is bigger than we ever thought it would be. Of course, we don't know what the future brings. Of course, there's a lot of interest in homeschooling, but one thing really is clear. People see homeschooling and unschooling as a choice. It's a choice just like private or public education. And that's always been my view. I know deeply, because I was a single mother, that not everyone can homeschool, right? I was a single mother who homeschooled, but was it a struggle? 100%. I can't see everyone doing this, but I can say that it should be a viable choice and alternative. And that's how I've always seen it. I've seen it as a choice among the varied choices that parents have for their kids. And I always think that parents should do what they authentically think is the best thing to do with their kids. So I always like to define the difference between homeschooling and unschooling because it is two very different things. So while homeschoolers might do school at home, worksheets, textbooks, things like that, unschoolers learn primarily through their own intrinsically motivated strengths and interests. They tend to choose activities based on their abilities, their interests, and their own learning styles. When we talk about assessment in homeschooling and unschooling, assessment in homeschooling might look like a test or a quiz. Assessment in unschooling tends to be more authentic and intrinsic. It tends to be, I learned this thing and I know that I've done well because I can see it with my own 2 eyes. Or I've learned this thing and it works and that's how I know I'm successful. So again, homeschooling might have more formal assessments while unschooling assessment is authentic and intrinsic. I ask Pat Ferenga, John Holt's colleague, all the time how much percentage of homeschoolers consider themselves unschoolers. And every year it gets bigger, right? I remember when Pat would tell me 5% of homeschoolers call themselves unschoolers. And now it's probably about 20%. And, there's a lot of terms here, right? Unschooling is this broad term. There's this umbrella when it comes to unschooling. So you have your more relaxed homeschoolers, you have these middle of the road unschoolers, and then you have radical unschooling. This terminology is new. 20 years ago, we called ourselves homeschoolers. We were just learning by living. But now the term unschooling has really caught on. And I think Peter Gray and I were actually the first ones to define the term. Do know that most unschoolers do start off as traditional homeschoolers. And then what happens is, and you all recognize this, right? You start off as a traditional homeschooler, you think there's going to be a lot of school at desk kind of thing. And as you go on, you realize there is so much to learn outside the home. You realize that your kids are learning through playing. You realize that your curriculum expectations have loosened, and you see how much learning and growing your child or teen is doing on their own. So it's very interesting to me how that grows and changes. And I'm just going to check chat. Oh, people are saying hi. In terms of historical perspectives, I'm sure if you saw Peter Gray's talk this morning, that Peter Gray did talk about hunter-gatherers, the learning through cultural transmission. And that is true, right? Like hunter-gatherers learned through their culture, they learned through their family. It was a really, really important way of learning. Rousseau later on talks about learning from the natural world, talks about learning through a tutor in Emily. And John Dewey, who's really, really big in the US, focused on this whole notion of a democratic society, but also focused on the notion of the fact that education is a process of living, right? And not preparation for future living. And I think that quote always sticks with me because a lot of homeschoolers, unschoolers, and teachers will always ask me like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous about how my child will grow up. And I'm always telling them, right, enjoy the process. Yes, of course, we are preparing our kids to be adults. Everyone is. But your job as a home educator, as an unschooler, is to really enjoy that process, that every day, because it's that process that in the end creates this very healthy environment for your child. We have A.S. Neal. I'm so excited. I hope some of you will join me at the Festival of Childhood in Summerhill this summer. But we have A.S. Neal, who is really, the first school focusing on freedom and autonomy for all students. I'm so excited to see what they do at Summerhill. It will be my first time there this summer. I've read so much of Neal. I've read all of his works, and he has a lot to say about freedom and autonomy for students and the power of that. You have Illich in terms of a historical perspective that talked about deschooling society in the 70s. And that was the first, 60s and 70s, that was a critique on compulsory education. And some people really enjoy Illich's work. I especially enjoy his writings about the power of apprenticeships, especially when talking about older homeschoolers or young adults in the world. And then you have who we consider the father of unschooling, John Holt, who wrote How Children Fail and How Children Learn. And he really opened up the term unschooling. You have John Taylor Gatto. If you haven't read him, he's very interesting. He was a New York City public school teacher that announced after 30 years that he was no longer really involved in that process anymore, that he wanted to work more on individuals learning at home, individuals learning more freely. And then, of course, you have Peter Gray and his book, Free to Learn, and also artwork. So you've met John Taylor Gatto in person. I love it. Yes, I spoke to his wife several times before he passed away. He is such an interesting guy. So interesting.
Yeah, he visited Scotland and we got to go and speak to him and meet him there.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah. Oh, so good. So good. He's a really interesting person. In terms of theoretical perspectives, I always talk about homeschooling and unschooling, and I talk about Edward Deci and Richard Ryan's work. So you have to understand that most of my writings, most of my research focus on Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. I've written about them for over 25 years now, and I've always connected them to the field of homeschooling and unschooling. I have always felt that homeschooling and unschooling are the best forms of intrinsically motivated education and learning that I have found. Their sub-theory of cognitive evaluation theory is really the way I talk about to my teachers, to homeschoolers, to unschoolers. It's really the focus of how to facilitate intrinsic motivation in students, right? Deci and Ryan talk about three things. They talk about competence and the importance of competence. They talk about autonomy and the importance of freedom and choice in learning. And they talk about the power of relatedness. And I just want to take it apart with you for a second, right? When you're thinking of homeschooling and unschooling, and you're thinking of how to facilitate a sense of competence in your kids, you are doing this naturally. You're doing this by focusing on their strengths and interests. You're doing this by continually really seeing what they can do and acknowledging them for that, right? So when your child or teen has completed a project or artwork or whatever they're interested in, right? You don't have to say like, great job. You'll be like, oh my God, like this is like, you can do this, right? And when people hear that they can do this, that raises a sense of competence in them. I am also not, even though I talk about and research intrinsic motivation, I am not a anti-extrinsic motivator because I know that that's how our world runs. So of course, I know I really thrive on compliments and praise, and so do kids, as long as it's authentic. Right. I think that's the really important part, that any compliments or praise that you give kids are authentic, that they feel it is meaningful to them, that you're not just saying great job and doing something else, that you're saying great job and really meaning it. Sense of autonomy is really important, right? This is thinking about how we can give freedom and choice to our kids and facilitate that. People take this and facilitate it in different ways. Of course, unschooling provides freedom from curriculum, freedom from the bounds of formal assessment. But you can also give little choice. It's really how much you're comfortable with, right? And what I'll say to my public school teachers who might not be so comfortable with choice is, let's try little choices. Right? Can you use a pencil or pen in the classroom? Do you have that choice? Can I write with markers or crayons if I want? Do I have that choice? And then you go on to bigger and bigger choices, and you realize that kids can independently make choices. And you get impressed by that. And the more choices that they make, the better off they are. Because I will tell you, as a person who studies adolescence, when adolescents grow up, knowing how to make choices and knowing how to make decisions, knowing how to go through the process of choice and decision making, right? They enter adulthood. The transition to adulthood is less rocky. It's really, I've done this all my life. I know how to make choices and decisions. I know the difference between a positive choice and a negative choice. I know that when I make choices and decisions, there's a dignity of risk, right? Because some decisions and choices are not going to turn out as we've planned. I want you to raise your hand if you've never made a bad choice in your life. Have you ever made a bad choice? Are you perfect? Oh, good. Oh, good. Oh, good. If you are good, I'm so glad. I am not. I have made several bad decisions. But there is that dignity of risk, right? Where we have to allow kids to make poor decisions, to learn from them, to make mistakes, to learn from them, because that is how we learn and that is how they learn. And so that is really, really important. Then there's this sense of relatedness, which brings it all together. Relatedness is very humanistic in DC and Ryan's theory. It really talks about the power of having one person, whether it be a parent or a mentor or someone in your life, that unconditionally loves and respects you no matter what. And it's so easy to unconditionally love and respect our kids because they're amazing human beings. But it's much harder to love and respect them no matter what, right? No matter if they do a thing that we disagree with, no matter if they make a choice or decision that we don't agree with, right? That no matter what part is hard, that relatedness is so easy when it's unconditional and it's good feeling and we're so proud of our kids. And that relatedness is harder when we disagree with them, but that's still an important part of this. And the reason why it's an important part is the more you facilitate that relatedness, that unconditional love, no matter what, the freer your child will become to be themselves, to make the choices and decisions that work for them. The freer your child will be able to experiment with different things and not bad things, right? Experiment with experiences, right? Some kids want to go out and travel really young. I know Peter Gray tells a story of his son going out. I think he was 13 and 14 and going to Europe. And I mean, I would have a heart attack, right? But Peter's like super calm about it because it was his son's choice. He really wanted to go and he went. Again, that unconditional love, respect, no matter what. And that provides a real true sense of freedom, which therefore provides a real true sense of intrinsic motivation. And this is what we really want to facilitate in our kids. So I've written so many articles about self-determination theory, cognitive evaluation theory, and home education. And I am happy to share those. I will give my contact information at the end. The interesting thing about being in this movement for so long is the growth that I've seen in the movement. Right? It used to be that homeschoolers really fell into two camps. They were Christian and Republican in the United States, or they were like more liberal and happy hippies, quote unquote. They were most always two-parent families. I think I was the only single parent that was homeschooling in 1996 that I knew, right? I will tell you that I love seeing the growth. The face of unschooling has changed dramatically. It has become so diverse. It has become diverse racially, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of the amount of children choosing unschooling and homeschooling for kids with special needs. There's also been an increase in students who identify as LGBTQ. I've studied every one of these families, right? My big study is coming out in the summer. This is focused on unschooling people who have chosen unschooling for students with special needs. I'm so excited about that one. And I've also written about unschoolers who are LGBTQ and their experiences unschooling and how it gave them the freedom and confidence to move gracefully through the world without worry of bullying or hurt. So really, really interesting study. It was published in Other Education about 2015. But again, we've seen such growth. We've seen such diversity. And for me, that creates such beauty in the movement. So that's really important to me. In terms of paths, you know, we've talked about this before. Most people are coming into unschooling after a period of homeschooling. There's also this concept of deschooling that's gotten a lot of press when we talk about unschooling. Deschooling is when, if your child has ever moved from a school environment to a home or unschooling environment, that transitional period of time when children are really, you know, maybe just kind of hanging out on the couch, or maybe just kind of feeling a lack of interest. We know now that that is totally normal. We know that just like we have periods of transition where we might not feel like our authentic selves, our kids have periods of transition when moving from one environment to another. That period of transition is natural and normal. A lot of people come to unschooling through conferences like Learn Free, through TED Talks and listening to speakers, listening to Naomi Fisher and listening to Heidi Steele and listening to all these amazing people that have come to the conference because they all have these wonderful ideas. And of course, you have a lot of people unschooling because they've gotten to know other unschooling families and they feel like, okay, I have a community here. This is acceptable now. And that's always wonderful. Everyone always asks, I think Peter gets this question. I think I get this question a lot about unschoolers not having a well-rounded curriculum. And my answer is always, I have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. I went to public schools. I have gaps in my learning. And so do unschoolers, right? Everyone has learning gaps. And I think that's natural and normal. We learn as we go. The one thing I will say about studying homeschoolers and unschoolers is that homeschoolers and unschoolers know how to learn. They know if they don't know something, they look it up. They know if they have questions about something, they ask people who are resource people, people who support them, people who they know in the community. One of the most widely known benefits is that individuals who unschool know how to learn and live a life of learning that is completely generalizable to the real world. And that is a real strength. And that is something that the unschooling and homeschooling community should just like really, really be excited about. We talk a lot in schools about the power of generalizable learning. We know it's something that schools do not do well. Homeschoolers and unschoolers do it amazingly because they live their lives in the world. In terms of the challenges of unschooling, you might have read Peter and I's study that we did in 2013. It was a large scale, it was the first large scale international study of 232 unschooling families. And when unschooling families talk about challenge, they constantly talk about social stigma. I will say that this study was done in 2013. I think there's a lot less social stigma on unschooling in 2022 because people know how it feels to homeschool or unschool in a pandemic. And that emergency home learning environment was helpful for people to understand why parents might choose to homeschool or unschool. I've had a lot of parents come to me and said, you know what, I never thought that I'd love homeschooling, and I do. So that always makes me really happy. But there is still a social stigma. There's a social stigma in many parts of the world. I am talking now to a parent in the Aleian Islands that has really gotten a runaround based on her decision to homeschool. And so we are trying to help her be able to continue that choice. I have done case studies of individuals in Hong Kong and around the world that have had, harsh criticism of their choice and have chosen to do it anyway. We know in France, right, there was that big like homeschooling being illegal in France. And so there's still a stigma, and we have to do our part to erase that stigma. And part of the way we erase that stigma is through more research, which is why I've literally dedicated my life to researching this, right? I felt the stigma as a person who chose to unschool. And the reason I do the work that I do is I want to legitimize the movement that's so important to me. 42% of parents said, it's really hard to get rid of the culturally ingrained thoughts about teaching and learning. Most of us as parents have experienced a schooled environment, right? We have some unschoolers who are raising unschoolers, but a lot of us are public school people or private school people who then have made the choice to home and unschool. And sometimes we do get nervous if our kids are not getting grades, or if our kids don't have transcripts, or how do we do this? Or, how do we know our kid is learning if they don't get the A? So those things are always a challenge. There is also time, career, and income effects, especially on the part of women who do most of the home learning for their families. And there are also legal issues surrounding unschooling, not only in the States, but also outside the United States. When we talk about benefits, this is where people lit up, right? You have increased student learning. You have all those amazing social, emotional benefits. You will constantly hear from homeschooling and unschooling families that they felt like their child became their real self, that their child was happier, that their child felt more self-adjusted, that their confidence went up. And this is all the power of homeschooling and unschooling. There was also an increase in positive family relationships, siblings getting along better, the family getting along better. And this is basically because everyone's in the same space, right? You guys know this as homeschooling parents. When you're in the same space together for an extended amount of time, you tend to learn to get along with each other. And that is a real benefit. And then there's, the family and individual freedom that comes from unschooling, freedom of, getting away from this school calendar, freedom of being able to travel when we want to, things like that. Peter and I loved the study we did of the 32 unschooling families, but we thought, wow, this looks a little too happy for us, right? It looks like unschoolers are fantastic. The families are having an amazing time. What if no one is telling the truth? This is the researcher in us, right? So in 2015, we did a follow-up study, and we studied people who have graduated from an unschooling environment, or adult unschoolers. And what we found was exactly, listen, families were telling the truth, right? Like the unschoolers reported having a good social life. Age mixing was a huge benefit. There was time to pursue one's interests. They felt intrinsically motivated. They felt like unschooling gave them this smooth transition to adulthood, all of these incredible things. And of course, I think the good thing is we did get 3 people out of 75 who reported negative experiences. These negative experiences often remind me of like Tara Westover, if you ever read the book Educated. She was in sort of this unschooling environment. And so those who had a negative experience did remind me a little bit of the Tara Westover story, where she had either parents with mental health issues or a parent that was highly religious. Interestingly, out of those 3 people who had negative experiences, 2 out of the 3 saw benefits in the unschooling experience overall. And 2 out of 3 also had advanced degrees. So you can take with it what you take of it, right? Like not everyone's experience is going to be the same, but that's a pretty small percentage of individuals who had a negative experience unschooling. I still think it's important, right? Homeschooling and unschooling is not for everybody, but it's certainly a wonderful choice for people who are happy with the choice. Everyone asks about higher ed. There are so many paths to higher education. Everyone always asks me, like, what happens when unschoolers graduate, right? Most adult unschoolers pursue higher education, and actually most adult unschoolers feel very comfortable in a college or university environment because they are used to choosing what they want to learn. They are used to creating their own schedule. Unschooling is actually really, really good preparation for college. You are responsible for yourself. And of course there are learnings, right? Like when my son went to college, again, his literal first day of school was his first day of college. He reported back that, Mom, I had to learn how to take notes, not because I was interested in it, but because of the test. And I had to learn to, be responsible for myself to wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning if I had an 8 a.m. class. I had to learn to really think about like mentors and think about who I could talk to for different things that were not like my parents. So I think it's important to note that there are learnings, but our schooled kids go through those same learnings, right? How many schooled kids have trouble getting up for an 8 a.m. class? How many school kids have to be reminded to go to office hours if they need help? How many schooled kids have to really think about how to take notes, right? So these are all things that unschoolers report, that schooled students report as well. I thought the last stat was interesting in our study of unschoolers. Most of them were completely financially independent, 78%. That meant no debt. That meant that they lived on their own. It was really, really incredible. Yeah, Juliet, it'd be very, very interesting. I don't want to even make, right? Like, I don't even want to make conclusions because I don't know what that might look like. Also, it would be very, very difficult to measure in like, I thought about this in prison systems, who was unschooled per se, and who might have dropped out of school, left school, not gained in any sort of education because their parents were negligent, et cetera, et cetera. I've thought about this a lot. So that's a really interesting question. I'd like to pause for a second because I like the unschoolers to tell their own story. And this quote, I feel, is really, really telling of the experience that unschoolers have. The biggest advantage of unschooling was that it smoothed the transition to adulthood instead of all of a sudden being thrown out into the real world of college or career at age 18. I was able to begin exploring these things at a young age and at my own pace. At 15, I was able to take a college class. At 16, I was able to start working a part-time job. I was able to enroll in college in what have been my senior year of high school. I didn't have to wait. Unschooling gave me the immediate benefit of time and space to explore my interests and ask myself questions such as, what kind of person am I? And who do I want to be? And then work to make those the same. And when you think about that, yeah, right? Like when you think about that, that's something as adults that we still work on. I don't know about you, but I'm in my mid 40s and I am still working on this, right? The notion of, what kind of person am I? Who do I want to be? And unschoolers are thinking about this younger, which I think is really interesting. I will also say that, right, there's different ways to unschool, branches of unschooling. You might have heard of world schooling or outdoor schooling. There's so many unschool co-ops. There's so many democratic self-directed learning centers. And these are all like offshoots of unschooling. They're democratic schools or free schools, or world schooling is choosing to travel and learn. Again, all of these branches of unschooling. Because I work in public education, I also like to talk about how unschooling might have made a mark when it comes to public schools. In the United States, we have what's called the National Opt-out Movement. It's been growing and growing. And these are parents and students and teachers who have become resistant to the types of formal tests and assessments that are given in schools, basically for state data. And so they have formed an opt-out movement. And again, this feels very unschooly to me, right? Saying that authentic assessment is the way to go. We don't like assessment for data. You have your Democratic or Sudbury schools. Peter Gray, Kevin Curry Knight, and I just did a study on Hudson Valley Sudbury School in the United States. And we did that study thinking that the results would be similar to our study on unschooling, and they weren't. And that was a really interesting study. In the United States, you have Monument Mountain Regional High School. A student there started the Independence Project. Basically, he asked his guidance counselor, hey, can I spend half a day doing what I want and seeing what comes out of that? And he did. And so if you want to look up the Independence Project, that's a really neat way of thinking about how unschooling can be inserted into public schooling. You have David Lane's One Period a Day. David Lane is a teacher in Massachusetts. He provides his students with 1 period a day to work on their own intrinsically motivated projects. And, you know, again, 1 period a day might sound very, very like a very small amount of time to homeschoolers or unschoolers. And it is a very large amount of time in a public high school. So he gives that 1 period a day. Students do their own intrinsically motivated projects. And then there's High Tech High School in California, and you'll notice that's a picture of it. There's a lot of open spaces. There's a lot of exploratory learning, a lot of project-based learning. And that is sort of an offshoot of what unschooling would be in a public school setting. I also, and my students have always seen university as unschooling, right? You have independent study, you've got independent projects, your curriculum is supposed to be generalizable. There's a lot of Socratic seminars, that dinner table discussion that you all have as unschoolers and homeschoolers, that lunchtime discussion. I mean, that's what happens at college, right? As we talk more about choice in colleges, we talk more about choose your own adventure type assignments, the civic and community engagement that you see in homeschoolers and unschoolers that you also see in college students. And of course, if you do your college experience right, you are studying what you love, as unschoolers do every day. So it's been so beautiful to be with you, to be in your presence. I want to spend a lot of time on Q&A, but if you would like to contact me, that is my email. It's griley@hunter.cuny.edu. And if you would like to learn more about my work, it's ginarileyphd.com. So I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to go look at the chat, and please, please, if you have questions, if you have concerns, anything, thoughts, I'd love to hear them. And yes, more universities are making exam scores optional, such as the GRE, the SAT, the ACT. I'm going to put you all in gallery view.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. So if anyone has questions or comments, you're actually welcome to unmute as well. And if there's a lot of you, you can raise hands on the reactions, but otherwise, I think just ask away.
I was just going to follow up, Gina, with that. The universities have, I don't know how far that your research has gone as far as like admissions, university admissions. How have they, or maybe you don't know, but what is the, I guess, current perception perhaps behind an unschooler who applies to a university versus, the student that ticks all the boxes and jumps through the hoops or whatever?
I get more recruitment calls from Ivy League universities asking me where the unschoolers are. I will tell you that they know more about unschooling now. They know about the differing types of experiences that unschoolers have. They know about the intrinsically motivated learning, and they want that. So I get more calls from admissions recruiters than I ever thought I would.
That's really interesting.
I think a lot of these universities are beginning to appreciate what these young people bring and are much more willing to consider sort of out of the box educational routes. And something that's quite interesting is that I've had many conversations with different sort of academics and people who are employing young people, and one of the things they say is they almost have to teach these children how to think for themselves, how to make decisions, how to problem solve, and that's the difference with home educators, is that generally their ability to take initiative and critical thinking and all of that is they're far more independent and confident. I've got one daughter who was looking around at universities, and I overheard one of the lecturers talking to a parent and saying, well, of course we spend the first year just teaching them how to manage their own study. And I said to my daughter, well, you might as well go straight to second year then. And then going to the parents' talk, and the parents' talk was about how you need to teach them how to use the washing machine and how to prepare a few simple meals, which is things that, my children, as soon as they're old enough, they're involved in that. They get to help. And so they're all become independent and confident at managing themselves, and it's one of the things that gets commented on the most is how they are able. They're often the ones helping their class, like my daughter at college, helping her classmates, making sure they know what's going on, because she does and they don't. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's so right. It's so interesting. Homeschoolers do life skills right. I will tell you, those homeschooling and unschooling families, the life skills, the daily living skills, 100%, they do them right. Same thing with decision making. I studied decision making in adolescents, and specifically adolescents with disabilities. And as we know, there are steps to decision making, and unschoolers and homeschoolers, because they have so much practice with it in their daily lives, are really great decision makers. So that to me is also an important thing. Asia, I think it's Asia. Does the child pick the subjects they want? So again, unschooling works in many different ways depending on the parent. But if you are in an unschooling environment, yes, you would pick the subjects that you want to study. And in terms of how they learn the selected subject, it would be exactly how you as an adult would learn a subject. So you might watch YouTube videos on it. You might pick out books from the library or the bookstore on it. You might then feel confident enough to generalize that and figure out how that looks in real life. So in terms of learning, the process of learning in unschoolers looks very much like the process of learning in adults. It is self-directed, it's intrinsically motivated, generally comes from an interest, then maybe they'll do visuals or YouTube videos, maybe go read a book about it, and then really look at how that generalizes to life. Awesome question.
I think I wanted to say something more about the life skills, is that I find what it does is it builds up their feelings of independence and confidence. So the life skills is actually really important, because one of the things that I picked up from John Holt was the fact that children actually want to be productive. And what actually really works well is when we as adults endeavor to be productive in our own lives and model that for our children, sometimes take them along for the journey and give them the opportunity to be involved and understand. Because one of the big problems with the education system is children actually don't know why they need to do what they're being told they need to do. So they'll say, well, why do I need to study this? Oh, well, because you've got to pass your GCSEs. And you can't get a job if you don't have your GCSEs, or you can't get, and that does, if you ask the young person, that's the answer they'll give you. There's no other reason why they're doing it. They don't understand. And it's kind of like working in a factory, in an assembly line. If you don't know the end product, why would you be motivated to do your little bit well? But when you understand the whole, you understand, oh, it's really important to do this part properly because this will break if I don't. And, there's that whole thinking. And, it's about mastery. So you want to learn that subject, you want to master it because, you want to come to terms with it. You want to rule it, and really grab hold of that. And we all have that ability, I think, to learn in that way when the right buttons are pushed, when the right things, and it's finding those, helping your children to discover what are those little buttons for them that just get it going. And it's not always straightforward, because I've got a son who's actually quite lazy. So, and he's got to be pushed a bit. And so you've got to kind of try and find out what is important to him, what will motivate him. And he's 24 now, and he's getting there. He now can pay his bills. And he's at university now, but it's we've had to be a lot more patient with him, because he wasn't there emotionally. He wasn't in the same place as his younger siblings, for example, at the same age. So,
yeah. And I'll say something controversial, which is from my studies of intrinsic motivation. I tend to think there's no such thing as lazy. That lazy tends to mean either tired or not ready to do something, or there's always a reason for the laziness, right? It's very rare that we are sitting on a couch being lazy without a reason. We're either tired, we're sick, or we're not ready to do something. And those are all really valid human emotions and physical things.
I would say in his case, I think it's got a lot to do with emotional maturity.
Yeah,
but it can be very hard being patient and waiting for these things to kick in, because he isn't lazy in some ways, and then he likes a bit of reward.
Yeah.
He likes show me the money, and then I'm there, I'll do it.
Everything motivates.
Yeah, it's his love language.
I love it. I love it. I love that you recognize that, and that he recognizes that, right? Yeah. That's important.
Yeah, but the intrinsic motivation is not working. He's got very strong intrinsic motivation to watch YouTube. Let's put it that way.
That's intrinsic motivation, as valid as any other. That really is. Awesome. Well, you guys have been, I'll take one last question, and you guys have been amazing and wonderful.
Come on, Joanna, you got something you'd really want to ask, I'm sure.
How do you know? Oh, Sandrine, that's lovely.
Let Joanna ask hers first, and then we'll come back to
Well,
Sandrine.
I was going to mention Julie Bogart's A Brave Learner book. I suppose she's one of the authors I've learned from as to how do you do this unschooling, because there's so many ways to unschool. there are unschoolers. And reading through it, I thought, but John Holt says this, but Charlotte Mason says this. And I thought, hey, why don't you quote your sources? You're claiming to invent this thing. This is all unschooling. I've read all of these people and you sound very much like them. But actually, I've forgiven her by the last chapter because she sort of has a very good comment. Basically, I think why she doesn't call her thing unschooling is because you're not allowed to be called that in America because unschooling is done this way. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she says one thing about not sticking. Basically, you read all these gorgeous blogs and you think, oh, if I don't do it this way, I'll ruin my kids. I haven't got a farm. Oh, what do I do? And actually, you shouldn't be that much of a purist. You can pick and choose. And I think that's quite good. Unschooling. I'd put unschooling as a, hashtag for Julie Bogart's book. But yeah, John Holt up there, and I'll look all the people I didn't know from your bibliography. And thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Again, like when I was doing this as a parent, it did not have a label. We were just living life. We just didn't go to school. And so it didn't have the sort of labeling that maybe Julie Bogart thinks is unschooling, or that other people like it has to look a certain way. And yes, I read those beautiful blogs and all I think about is, wow, I don't know if our blog would have been as beautiful, right? Like all of social media is, right? We definitely advertise the beautiful moments. We tend to hide the moments that make us less than perfect. But those moments are as important. So just remember that when you look at unschooler blogs and you're like, my life doesn't look like this, right? Like everyone has their social media story. How do you know what opportunities to offer is a really wonderful question. In unschooling, it is in purest unschooling, it would be up to your child to kind of find the opportunities that interest them. That being said, I will say, like, my son was interested in rocks. We went to the library a lot. We used to go hiking a lot. He got more interested in rocks. Then we got really into geology, and we would try to find places like caves or things that he could explore. Again, it just came about naturally and organically, and you have to understand I did it without having any money. So whatever free thing I could do, I did. So I wasn't really offering opportunities as much as I was following his interest and lead. So yes, there are definitely degrees of unschooling. You do not have to be all or nothing. Peter Gray and I define it very loosely. And I think that you unschool the way you unschool. Like, my unschooling might not have looked like unschooling to you. But there are many, many different ways to unschool. There's not just one way. It's not like no rules, no subjects. And I think that's good advice for everything, right? There's always a gray area. Nothing's ever all or nothing, and nothing's ever, this is what good homeschooling looks like versus this is what bad homeschooling looks like, right? It's all what works for your kid.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people use the term now self-directed education, and I think that is actually unschooling as well. I think unschooling is self-directed. It's they're very much intertwined, and I tend to refer to my children as self-directed, really, because I know I didn't direct it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things you do as a parent is you give your children this amazing gift of time to really get their teeth into a subject and something they enjoy. But it's interesting you use the example of your son being into rocks, because I often use that example about how when your child goes to school and the teacher says, right, class, today we're going to learn about, the Tudors, and the child is interested in rocks. And I always use the example of rocks. And if the child is interested in rocks, the teacher's like, no, Johnny, we can't learn about rocks today. We're learning about the Tudors. So Johnny has to sit there listening through the Tudors, and then they go on to the next thing and they're learning about, the rainforest. But Johnny wants to learn about rocks, and it's kind of like, the thing is that that child can be sitting there, that child can be physically present, that child can have the teacher standing in front of them and talking, but it does not mean they're learning unless they are actually engaged.
And I will tell you, the best teachers, right, as someone who, again, teaches public school teachers, the best teachers will take that and really key into that. And the next lesson will be about rocks, or the next lesson will be about, geographical formations during the time of. So again, for me, it's not either or, it's always like this place on a spectrum.
I think the problem for teachers in this country is they couldn't do that.
Yeah. Well,
The
neither,
national, so they don't have that ability to they don't have that freedom to go, which is, I think, a sadness, a real sadness.
Oh, nor mine. I mean, New York City public schools, you can read about them. But they do try.
Yeah. Okay, so does anyone else have any questions for Gina? Last questions, anyone?
I just wanted to make a quick comment that I really appreciated you talking about the learning gaps, because I feel like, as somebody who does allow our children to be self-directed, that, every once in a while there are those moments like I had yesterday when our music teacher came over, and he was talking about pentatonic scale to my 10-year-old, and he's like, how many notes in the pentatonic scale do you think? And he kept giving clues, like the Pentagon in DC, and like, how many sides in a and she was just like 6, 10, and I mean, it was just
no idea. Yeah.
And so it was one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. But I just, after, and he's so gracious, we love him, but it was one of those moments that I thought, well, up to this moment in time, she actually didn't need to know what pent meant, and now she does, and she'll probably remember it more than if I had drilled her on tri and quad and pent and all the, and whatever year that was supposed to happen. And so so that was very encouraging to know, like, okay, like, I don't, in those moments where you feel like, what have I done? I failed you. Like, just relax. Like, she hasn't had to know that until just now.
I love that, Brittany, because I honestly didn't even think of that until you said it. My son teaches music on the side, and let me tell you something, you just said it, and I'm like, oh, now I know how many notes are on it. So no worries about those learning gaps for me.
Well, I think
all have them.
The thing is, there's no way to know everything, and no teacher knows everything. If this piece of paper represents everything there is to know, we know like this bit. Yeah. And so I think we have to take that pressure off ourselves. And definitely, if you're in school, there's definitely going to be gaps. There would be different gaps, but there will be gaps. And I think we can actually, I remember early on in my journey, somebody said to me, let's just make peace with the fact there will be gaps.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's gaps in all learning, schooled, unschooled, however you want to do it. Everyone has learning gaps, and we know how to learn. We know how to
exactly
gaps. Yeah.
Yes, and you show them how to access the information, how to go and find it, and then they do, which I do a lot because they ask me things that I don't know the answer to all the time. So
I love it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Gina. It's been an absolute delight to spend our evening with you, and we really appreciate that.